You're listening to Ecosysteming, the podcast redefining economic development through the lens of equitable entrepreneurship, 2 decades in the making. Join NC Idea's Tom Rue as he engages with entrepreneurs and experts who are challenging the status quo and driving lasting change.
Welcome, listeners of the Ecosysteming podcast. I am your host, Tom Rue, and today, let me just tell you who I'm joined by today. This gentleman has been dubbed the leading national watchdog of state and local economic development subsidies, an encyclopedia of information regarding subsidy, and God's witness to corporate welfare, also as the OG of ensuring that state and local tax policy actually supports good jobs, sustainability, and equity. So, of course, I am referring to Greg LeRoy, Executive Director of a National Policy Resource Center that promotes corporate and government accountability and economic development, which is better known by the name of Good Jobs First. Greg, thank you so much for joining us on the pod today.
Great to be with you, Tom.
That was one of the funner intros I've got to do. You always have to love a guest who's had that kind of track record to merit such superlatives and very colorfully, but also very much on brand to the point of what the organization does. For the benefit of our listeners, I should mention that we do know each other, and you were kind enough to join us in 2022, I believe it was, for our statewide entrepreneurship ecosystem summit, where, you know, as the kids say, you brought the receipts to that little soiree of ours. And by receipts, I mean really talking to the essence of what the organization does. So, you know, probably a good place to start is, you know, giving you the floor to talk about Good Jobs First, you know, what it is, why it is, and what you hope comes from the work that it does.
Well, thanks, Tom. So I founded Good Jobs First in 1998. We're 27 years old, and I had been working on economic development issues for a dozen years before that in Chicago. This is a very accidental interest and career for me. I got involved in helping people try to stop factory shutdowns starting in the mid-1980s, you know, a decade before NAFTA, when even in the Midwest already there was disinvestment happening and plants were closing. And because of some previous work I did, I sort of knew the alphabet soup of incentive. I knew what an industrial revenue bond was and an enterprise zone and a property tax abatement and training grants and UDAGs, the old UDAG program from HUD and things like that. And we started finding that a lot of the plants that were closing had gotten incentives in the past. And it was kind of like, hey, what's that about? What, you know, are they taking the money and running? Weren't these incentives supposed to secure the jobs, improve the jobs, you know, modernize the factory, whatever? And in most cases, the fine print didn't fix things. You literally could take the money and run. But in a few cases, we actually had the ability to challenge legally. But more often, it was a campaign, you know, messaging issue. That is, like, hey, Mayor so-and-so, Governor so-and-so, whoever gave them the money, what are you going to do about this plant closing? Our taxpayer dollars are getting wasted. And I collected the reforms that came up in the wake of that in a book called No More Candy Store in 1994. And then I started Good Jobs First 4 years later. So our mission really is to help states and local governments by helping public officials, journalists, community groups, labor unions, environmentalists, smart growth advocates, anybody who's trying to reform economic development incentive programs to get a better bang for the buck, to reduce waste, to improve transparency, to make things more effective, to prevent companies from getting windfalls to get paid to do what they would have done anyway.
Wait. Stop the bus. If I heard you correctly, you were actually suggesting, and again, I want to give you the opportunity to correct the record.
Yeah.
that companies will ask for incentives to do things that they were going to do anyhow.
Yeah, that's the sad truth of it. Yeah.
Hashtag sarcasm, right? Since the viewers can't see that we're kind of grinning at each other, obviously I'm being silly with this, but it is to make a point. because one of the things that you highlighted at our summit, and it's also in just through the body of your work, is that many people would characterize this type of giveaway as a race to the bottom, and it's really and you get the behavior you incentivize. That's human nature.
Yep.
And it seems that, large companies, actually not even so large companies anymore, pretty much just companies that, know enough or can hire consultants that know enough that say, hey, I mean, you might as well ask, right? Because what does it cost to ask? And you may be surprised on what you get just by asking. Is it as simple as that, or am I oversimplifying it?
It's partly that simple, and partly there's a backstory that most people don't understand. So, the second book I wrote, called The Great American Job Scam, which came out 20 years ago in 2005, I spent a couple chapters explaining the real way companies decide where to expand or relocate. And I look at that from the viewpoint of the companies and the site location consultants they often employ to help them find where they want to go. And when you break down, when you really kind of crawl inside that process, what you find is that it's the business basics that almost always determine where companies go. It's not tax rates and it's not tax breaks. And the reason is because tax rates and breaks are just not a big issue in terms of the cost factors, right? When companies are choosing where to go, they weigh costs and they weigh benefits, and they're willing to pay for benefits that they need, but they're mindful of their costs. But for the average company in America, and this is not me, this is the IRS speaking, for the average company in America, all state and local taxes combined as a share of their cost structure equals only 1.9%, which is to say the business basics, raw materials, labor, occupancy, logistics, energy, IT, bananas, raw steel, water, whatever it is that they use a lot of, make up 98.1% of their cost structure. So tiny variations in those big cost variables dwarf anything you could do with the tax.
And that's crazy when you consider kind of the public discourse and the narrative around that, right? Because what do we, I'll say it this way. Here in North Carolina, we're very, very, very proud of a certain distinction that we have received 3 out of the last 4 years. And that is that the Brain Trust, the Mensa Group over at CNBC, has proclaimed North Carolina the best state for doing business. Invariably, and that this is spanned between, this is a bipartisan offense because the Republicans crow this as much as the Democrat governors, plural, because the previous one was crowing about this as well. It's, the tax structure. It's the low tax structure in the state of North Carolina. That's a big driver of why these companies want to, move to North Carolina. If I heard you correctly, that's a bupkis. That ain't true.
Oh, it is true. Look, I mean, here's why. Right? Look, the public discourse is distorted because when it comes time to announce deals, of course, companies want to applaud politicians who may have given them a big tax break or a land deal or whatever. And politicians obviously are all too glad to take credit for the deal, even if what they did didn't really matter, because they want to get reelected. And there is empirical evidence showing that if voters think somebody has been active on the economy, as in, issuing press releases and attending groundbreakings and cutting ribbons, they are more likely to get reelected, even though it didn't really matter for the economy.
Yeah, and again, I'm being a little cynical about it because I've been fighting. I feel like Don Quixote here, tilting at windmills, trying to make the case for this. Among the things that I take issue with is they'll always take the cost of plant construction and they call that an investment. They'll say company X is going to invest $1 billion in this semi-rural county, and it's going to create 2,000 jobs. And for that, we're going to give them $400 million in tax incentives. And, there's this notion that what it costs them to build a factory, that's cost of doing business. That $1 billion investment in construction, yeah, there's some temporary construction jobs, so some people will get some work out of it. Once it's built, that's not a community asset, right? You're not having your daughter's quinceañera party, in the beautiful glass lobby, and there's not an ice skating rink in the back that you can go enjoy in the winter. More than likely that brand new building is behind armed security, but it sure does put a tax on sewage, water, electricity, traffic, congestion, housing. So all those negative impacts are certainly felt and realized, but this notion of an investment amount being correlated to, the benefit, I think is willfully misleading and frankly just plain old dishonest.
Yeah, well, you just touched on so many issues relevant to this debate about helping people unpack what matters and what really happens. So, the label we put on what you just said is induced costs of growth. That is, people forget that when you allow a company to arrive and not pay local property taxes, not pay local sales taxes, maybe get some other subsidies on utilities or whatever, you induce growth, right? Because some of the jobs are going to get filled by people coming from other places. If it's a big project, 80+% of the new job takers won't be incumbent residents. We know this from research done by people like Tim Bartik. Um, well, those people are going to have kids to go to school. They're going to need their trash picked up. You're going to have to pave more miles of road and pick up more trash and respond to more 911 calls. And none of those things are free. So the question is, who pays for it? And the answer is everybody but the company that got the tax break.
Yeah, there's just some real irony to all of that, especially when you consider, some of the people that actually applaud and support these kinds of incentive packages are the same ones that say, are against anything that's like social net, or just providing essential services. That's not the job of the government, and the government shouldn't be picking and, winners, losers, or, which projects are higher priority. Yet they turn a blind eye to everything you just said, right? Everything. And I don't understand how that isn't more obvious other than what you alluded to earlier. Maybe is it just as simple as political partisan motivations?
I mean, and it's not partisan as in red or blue. It's really a bipartisan. I mean, if you were to put D's or R's or I's after the names of the villains in my book, there'd be many of all of them. I guess the other thing to say here is, North Carolina has a particular role in this history. So until the early 90s, when NAFTA was passed and the foreign automakers started locating their plants in right to work states instead of the upper Midwest, like the BMW deal in South Carolina, for which North Carolina, came in second or third. North Carolina had a very distinct philosophy, a kind of libertarian philosophy, saying we're going to keep our taxes and regulations as low as possible, but everybody's going to pay something, and we're going to have great roads, great schools and universities, efficient infrastructure, and that was a really winning strategy, right? North Carolina was a high performing state before NAFTA, and it has been since. That opened up losing, and I put in air quotes, losing the BMW deal was kind of the moment where the state then enacted the William S. Lee Act and other things. And there's been very uneven outcomes in some of those deals since then. Frankly, the most prominent failure being the Dell deal in Winston-Salem in 2004, which was the biggest deal in the history of the state at that time. It was $250 million guarantee in state and local incentives. And of course, the plant lasted a very short period of time, right? Uh, and went kaflooey in 2009 or 2010, if memory serves. So the because and it was a screwdriver shop, right? It didn't bring a supply chain. It wasn't an integrated operation. It was a screwdriver shop, as we say, an assembly shop. So, there's a lot of cautionary lessons here. The other thing to say is, to its credit, North Carolina has also been a better than average transparency state. It went online with William S. Lee Act, company specific, deal specific information on the internet in 2003, 22 years ago, well ahead of most other states. And uh, as I recently pointed out in an op-ed, sadly, that best practice has not held up on data centers. The state is being unusually secretive now when it comes to internet giants like Google's old data center in Lenoir and places like that. But aside from data centers, the state's been laudably transparent.
Why do you suppose it is less so on the data centers? I mean, I know what they say. It's like it's competitive intel. Like, and if we disclose all that, then we're giving our competitor states, giving away our secrets as to how we're becoming more attractive. But I mean, is that do you buy that argument, or is there something more to it?
I don't buy that argument. I mean, we just did a study documenting that more than 20 states disclosed their aggregate revenue losses. 3 states have very granular company-specific data, project-specific data. 12 states don't, including North Carolina, disclose even one aggregate figure for how much revenue they lose to data centers. And we think that's nuts. Um, but there's nothing competitive here. You're not. These data center companies know each other very well. There's a ton of trade press on them. They're a highly scrutinized, highly profitable, massive global industry. There's not a lot of secrets among them. So that's baloney in terms of competitiveness.
A few months ago, I was invited by Senator Tillis's office to a kind of a private economic development summit. It was held in DC in the Senate building. Fun fact, I didn't know they had a room in that building that could house about 250 people, but they do. It's up on the ninth floor. And, of the few curious things that I heard over the course of 2 days, the one that stuck with me, and I would, you know, bet you a buck to a bag of donuts that you are definitely seeing this, is that this war is the next kind of frontier of this war is going to be won or lost on the ability for power generation because of things that are now very well documented, like how much energy these data centers, for example, consume. And at least in the state of North Carolina, I was surprised to see because they had both R's and D's, speak to us. That most of the electorate of North Carolina, participated, and they seem to be hand stacked on nuclear power, and it's the first time I heard SMR, small modular reactors. And so apparently, if I was tracking this correctly, the days of like a big industrial park, let's call it a 2,000 acre industrial park going in, and we have Duke Power here in the state, having to worry about how they're going to electrify all that. No worries, because now these industrial parks will have their own dedicated nuclear power plant. I'm a kid from Northeast Ohio that grew up in the shadow of the Perry nuclear power plant. I still remember drills for when, there was like a release of radioactive steam and we had to do just like our fire drills. So that kind of scared the what out of me. But I am told that technology is much safer considering we've had now decades of armed service members, you know, going for weeks, if not months, under the surface of the ocean in our nuclear subs, powered by the same technology and being just fine and thriving just fine. But I found that just to be fascinating. I mean, am I stating the obvious here that power is going to be one of those big competitive frontiers and who's going to be more successful bringing these plants in?
No, you're absolutely right. So data centers really have dominated our plate in terms of new issues for the last 10 months, maybe. We're actually part of a national table of groups that meets every 2 weeks to try to wrangle these issues. Um, the big picture insight location in data centers now is available supply and price of power, because some markets like Northern Virginia have really kind of maxed out. And Virginia is a very troubling story. And we've been telling people in North Carolina to look to Virginia as a cautionary tale, right? Because the official estimate by the Audit Review Committee there in Virginia is that within 10 years, power needs will double, and 20 years, they'll triple at current rates of data center construction, um, which means there's going to have to be both a lot of new capacity built, but also a lot of new power lines built to wheel in power from other parts of the multi-state so-called JPM, Southeast grid system to which both of our states belong, both Virginia and North Carolina belong. That's really something. Uh, and the projections on the short term is that the majority of power in the next 3-year horizon to meet that demand will come from new natural gas turbines, not nuclear, because the lag time is longer on nuclear, and the SMR technology is still evolving. When that means air quality issues, and it also means that the you know targets the states have set for carbon neutrality and green job development are all going to get blown up, frankly, and pushed back, because and we're going to extend the life of fossil fuel plants in some cases, or revive 3 Mile Island and other nuclear plants, legacy plants, because the demand, data centers are. Another way to look at it is this: in the United States, between like 2009 and 2022, the aggregate demand for electricity was nearly flat, and that was even true in the state of Virginia. And that's because even though population and GDP were growing, and efficiency was growing too, right? We were switching to EVs and light bulbs, better light bulb CFLs. We were using better HVAC systems. We've just gotten better at managing electricity consumption. But since 2023, 2022, we're back to growth rates of almost like the 1950s in terms of energy consumption. And it's mostly about data centers.
Is that one of the things that I mean, what would you say the public least understands about this proliferation in data centers? I mean, the usual media outlets are doing a good job right now. I think most people are aware that they're really bad for water usage, consumption, and I've heard light pollution, noise pollution. I'm wondering, and maybe this is something you're alluding to with the states that are being not transparent, that I don't think the jobs, specifically the wages, right? From what I understand of most data centers, they're black room operation.
That's right.
These aren't like super high skilled AI prompt engineers that can command, $100 million salaries if you want to go work for Meta. These are people that, turn keys to turn powers on and off and open cages and pull out a server blade and push in a new server blade. And I don't mean to denigrate that job or that workforce at all. That's what keeps the economy humming. But those jobs are not paying six figures.
No, I mean, I think, a lot of data centers in the earlier generations created 20 jobs. Now some of them create 50 jobs. But after the construction phase, and we love the fact that in many markets, the work is union construction work. I hope that's true in North Carolina, or at least some of it is.
Oh, I wouldn't hold your breath on that.
In any case, once it's built, you've got basically a couple people at a time on shifts watching screens to make sure nothing glitches, and security guards and landscapers and maintenance people for the exterior, and people to periodically work on the standby power generation systems, maintenance, because those have to be run and ready in case there's a power outage. But it's very, very small numbers of permanent jobs. If there's a problem, they pick up the phone and call a contractor, and hopefully that's a union contractor that comes in and troubleshoots. And as you said, every 3 to 5 years, typically the servers have to get swapped out, and that creates a burst of work. But again, it's contracted out.
Yeah, and I would imagine nowhere close like a pro rata benefit to cost
No.
and environmental impact that like a traditional factory would have.
Even the official estimate for the state of Virginia, and I think this might be kind of rosy, is that the state loses 52 cents for every dollar it spends on subsidies for data centers. And I'm not sure that calculation includes the growth that they do induce.
So why are they doing it? Are they going to make up the margin on volume?
Look, I think there's a sheen around tech, kind of like there's a sheen around Hollywood, right? But both film production tax credits, TV production tax credits, and data centers are big losers for taxpayers. Film credits, you're lucky to get back 20 cents on the dollar. You lose 80 cents, give or take. Many studies prove that. And yet, politicians love to hobnob with Hollywood and appear active on the economy.
It's not to belabor the point, going back to the CNBC, best states for doing business. One of the reasons why we rank so high is because we have a well below average unionized workforce.
Right.
And this is one of the things I kept, once I looked under the hood a little bit, and others are doing the same. There was a recent op-ed written by a gentleman, Sam Grote, who's CEO of the NC Business Impact Forum. And he just basically said CNBC has a certain narrative of what should be a good state for doing business. And it's basically low corporate taxes, weak labor protections, generous corporate handouts, right? And so the states that align with the rubric that they state is good then get rewarded by being called top of this ranking. But this ranking is something we created to affirm a narrative. That's PR. That's not science. That's not economic development, right? That's just good content. And I would stress good being subjective.
This is another key part of the whole public narrative. So the phrase for what you're talking about is business climate or business climatology. That is, and this is a contested area that emerged 51 years ago, beginning with this company called Fantas, which was the granddaddy of site location consulting firms. It was actually born in the 1930s. They were commissioned by the what's called the Council of State Manufacturers Association to publish the first business climate study. And then they were aghast at how it got abused, because opportunistically what happened was the manufacturers associations, whose political agendas in state capitals were to say, let's get rid of the unemployment insurance tax, or let's cut the workers' comp rates, or let's gut the Department of Labor, or let's reduce the corporate income tax rate. All they wanted to do was weight those variables highest because they were there on the political agenda, and they wanted to raise public debate about their favorite topics, before the state legislature that year, even though there was no causal relationship between those issues and the success of the economy, or the growth of personal income, or job creation, or any of the other things that people would normally care, life expectancy, and none of these things. So there's actually in 1985, a group called the Corporation for Enterprise Development, thanks to a longtime North Carolina resident named Bill Schwecke, the late Bill Schwecke, published the first of several that have been published since, counter studies kind of puncturing the methodology behind these and these other anti safety net, anti, uh, you know, whatever you want to call them, forms of business climate debates. And it's contested terrain to this point, right? You've still got CNBC coming out. You've still got the American Legislative Exchange Council with the rich states, poor states. You've still got Beacon Hill Institute. You've got the Tax Foundation. There's a raft of flavors out there. If you go to gradingstates.org, a creation by the now retired Professor Peter Fisher, you can see a very sophisticated counter analysis of the methodologies in these business climate studies. And I'm putting business climate in air quotes.
Yeah, I hear you. I see you doing that. And yeah, it's a shame that we can't have more transparent and honest dialogue around these topics. We just recently interviewed for the pod the director of research for the Economic Innovation Group, and they publish the Distressed Communities Index and Business Dynamism Index. And if I had, which I don't, but if I had the magic wand to say, hey, listen, if we're going to kind of redefine best practices in economic development, you want to give these types of incentives, then it's got to be some sort of sliding scale of community return based upon which communities, that this investment is going to be going into. And it was fascinating to understand that, like, in the state of North Carolina, and the reason I refer to their data frequently is when we look at where we're trying to have greater impact while we build out this statewide ecosystem, we have, I think at the time, last I looked at it, we had 5 or 6 shared county borders. So that's a county, 2 counties that share a border, where one county is in the top quintile and the other county is in the bottom quintile of the Distressed Communities Index. And when you look at what that means from just a quality of life, standard of living,
Yeah.
right? You have citizens that are separated by no more than 10 miles living dramatically different lives. One of prosperity and hope and optimism, and one of like, how do I get through the day? And so not to factor such kind of, or to consider such factors when thinking about who's going to get what bag of goodies and how big the fruit basket's going to be. Candidly, I think it's kind of obscene, and it's certainly a disservice to the citizens of your state. But I digress.
Well, no, I'm trying to think of the name of the program there. It's not the JDIG program. It's a different program. There's been audits done. Bill Schwecke used to draw my attention to these, but you have a program there that puts your counties into tiers, tier 1, 2, and 3 counties. And the incentive is sweeter in the more distressed counties and less lucrative in the prosperous counties. But the audits continue to find that all the money and new investment went to the prosperous counties.
Yes.
Which goes to this whole windfall argument, right? About paying companies to do what they would do otherwise and not really causing them to do something different with a tax break.
Yep. And now I remember in 2022, the timing was just such that you had fresh energy around, I think it was the Apple deal, and the deal that the state cut with Apple to move what was, I think, purported to be their largest, external expansion outside of where their headquarters is. Have you happened to keep up with that deal? Do you know what's going on with Apple in the great state of North Carolina?
No, do tell.
Yeah, that ain't happening. And, I think the official word is it's been paused for 4 years. And I'm sure there's somebody gonna be listening to this. I'm gonna get that wrong, so they can write me and tell me that how wrong I was. But it's and from what I've heard from people that are in the know, it's basically just it's not gonna happen anymore. And so, but you don't like the bell was already rung, right? We already had the pressers and the ribbon cuttings and all the grand proclamations. And we've also gone through the exercise to demonstrate to ourselves we actually could, with a straight face, put together almost $1 billion package for such a vanity piece, right? Only for it to be fizzling out. And I don't know, is there ever true accountability on these? Because usually, the people that get all the benefits from that, they're no longer where they were when it all unravels. And, the gratification is immediate, but the accountability is delayed, if ever.
That's right.
For as an expert, as a national, world-renowned expert, I should say. Don't let me undersell your credentials here. Are there states? Is anybody getting it right? Is anybody doing it right? Like, who would you put out there as kind of like a best in class?
So we have three sort of sets of report cards that we issue on the states. We grade states on transparency, that is how well before and after deals they disclose costs and benefits. We grade states on how well they require people to create jobs and create good jobs. And we grade states on how well or how poorly they watch the store. That is clawbacks or performance based, you know, benchmarks to prevent taxpayer money from getting, ripped off. And there's no one state that ranks at the top of all those. Although honestly, North Carolina doesn't do terribly um, as a general rule, especially because of its history on better than average transparency, uh, dating back to 2003. Um, but no, we can't point to any one place that checks all the boxes, top tier. And frankly, even on transparency, most states still have a long way to go to even on their biggest, most expensive programs.
That is a shame. I was hoping you were going to say, yes, here's two states. And I would have assumed it'd be like Vermont or some blue state up in the New England.
No, I mean, transparency has been a thing for some southern states for a long time. Texas does well. Um, Tennessee got better. North Carolina was an early adopter. It's not a blue red thing really.
It- and thank you for pointing that out. I would always want any bias I have to be checked, and let's you're trading in facts, so let's make sure of that. And again, thank you for that.
Sure,
But it's really it's about a bigger picture, right? And once again, I'll come back to CNBC. One of the things where the critics are on all that is understanding how much they downweight other factors like quality of life, right? And in North Carolina, for example, we're 32nd in GDP per capita. We're 42nd in median household income. We're 31st in high school graduation rates, 37th in pre-K enrollment, 36th in child poverty, 40th in home ownership, 40th in health insurance coverage, and 37th in life expectancy. So I, I tell you
and
what,
those are things that matter.
those are the things that matter.
Yes,
And I would happily fall 3, 4, 5, even 10 places in those rankings if any of those, let alone all of those that I just, counted off, would go up substantially.
right.
Because if we did, which are the important things, it would, math is math. It would pull our rankings down.
Look, I'll leave you with a thought here, Tom. Taxes and public services are a value proposition, and people aren't dumb, and companies aren't dumb, right? They know what they're paying for, and they expect to get what they're paying for, and they care about it, right? So it's a well established fact, for example, that people will move into higher housing cost areas to get access to better school districts. We know that at the local level. That's great schools are a very strong predictor of real estate values. Conversely. There's a great set of research being done by people like Michael Hicks at Ball State University in Indiana, looking at a very granular level about where people are moving. And this goes to the issue of, Elon Musk bashed California has he left for Texas because Texas doesn't have a personal income tax and California does, for example. But as Michael Hicks and others have looked at this, you have to remember, lots of people move to California from Texas too. It's actually Texas is the third largest source of immigrants to California, for example. And when people move in either direction, they find people move to the high-cost metro areas that have the best quality of life. They have the highest taxes, but they also have the best quality of life. So it's a value proposition. You pay for what you get. You can't just be maniacal about costs and ignore benefits. That's a fool's errand.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you should pay for, what you get.
Yeah.
And that starts taking us really down the slippery slope of tax avoidance,
Right.
where people with the means and actually the generating and stressing the system, sometimes are the ones most avoiding taxes, yet they disproportionately are the beneficiaries of community amenities and assets,
Thank you.
not only in service of their work, but just in service of their personal lives. And again, that we somehow can in one side of our mouth say like, oh, we don't want, lazy people getting certain social welfare benefits without working for it. But I don't want to pay to ensure that if my mansion should ever catch on fire, the fire department's going to show up and put out the fire. Right. And that's, like I said, I think we're going to have to leave it there and leave that. We'll pick that thread up. If not on our next podcast, maybe we'll get you back to the summit one day and you can rile up the crowd like you did in 2022. Because I got to tell you, there's still people. Oh, heck, I just gave your name in reference to a colleague of mine not more than a month ago. He had reached out. It said, hey, that guy that was talking about the incentives. I'm like, yep, Greg LeRoy. So thank you.
Let's do it.
Thank you for the work that you're doing. I think it's important. If I tell you what, let me give you the closing to any policymakers, elected officials that may tune in. We're actually starting to get some on the podcast, which is encouraging because it gives us just a half hour to hopefully elucidate them, or at least give them an alternative model to consider. What advice would you give them when the next big JDIG project comes before them?
I would say a couple of things. If it's a data center, walk away from it. It's a loser. And, just explain to people it's a loser. If a big JD project comes along, vet the company. Try to be serious about the company's real intent and its business plan and where the project fits credibly or not into that company's business plan. VinFast comes to mind in that respect, for example. And veer to the small. That is, you have ecosystems like Research Triangle there in North Carolina that have had fantastically successful histories investing in public systems that benefit lots of young, promising companies, some of which will become gazelles and big job creators. Bank on that history, not the mega deals.
I couldn't have said any better. And we're trying to at the moment with this project called NC Innovation. But even that right now, we're trying to get in our own way on that too. And so I think the future of that is yet unwritten, but hopefully cooler heads will prevail and we'll find the courage and the faith and remember that we're probably the best investing in ourselves. So Greg, thank you so much for joining us. It was a real pleasure. I enjoyed it immensely. I hope we can talk again. It's been 2.5, 3 years. Let's hope it doesn't take that long for the next time.
Thanks, Tom. Great talking.
Stay connected with NC Idea on LinkedIn and Facebook, and subscribe to our newsletter for all the latest as we celebrate our 20th year. Catch new episodes of Ecosysteming every other Tuesday. Thanks for tuning in and being a part of this thing of ours.